Faulkner FSA is an archaeologist, historian and activist. He works as a writer, lecturer and broadcaster, and he directs field projects at home and abroad. His many books include A People's History of the Russian Revolution, Creeping Fascism, Brexit, Trump and the Rise of the Far Right, and A Radical History of the World. He is also a television archaeologist and historian, BBC 2's Time Watch, Channel 4's Time Team, Channel 5's Reveal, Sky Atlantic's The British, and many others. He will argue that the current global crisis is multifaceted, with economic, social, geopolitical and ecological dimensions, and insoluble without the dispossession of the 1% as highest earners and democratic control over society's resources. He will further argue that the alternative is barbarism, and that this possibility is already apparent in the tidal wave of nationalism, racism and fascism now sweeping across the world. He'll speak for 40 minutes or so, and there will be time for questions and discussion and dissent, he says. So, please welcome Neil Faulkner. Thank you very much.
One of the interesting things about these events nowadays is, and you know, you don't know how much you're going to agree with other sort of contributors at events like this. And if you're a Trotskyist revolutionary, you rather suspect you're going to disagree with virtually everything that is being said. And it's very interesting that there is there's much more of a consensus, I think, than there used to be among socialists and liberals, given what we confront in the world today. There was very little that Anthony Grayling had to say that I would have dissented from. I was pleasantly surprised by that. I think we probably have similar views on Trump and Brexit, and I will be neutral in the manner to which I have now been taught to be by an eminent professor of philosophy, in what is obviously the tradition now at the Malvern Festival of Ideas. And let me also say, something we have very much in common is that we are passionate about democracy. And there's often misunderstanding about the relationship between socialism and democracy. Interesting that Anthony quoted Thomas Rainborough in the Putney debates, and I did have a quick look in my book just to check that I had used that quote in the section on the English Revolution, and I had, because it's one of my favourite quotes. And democracy is actually fundamental. Democracy is a bit of a theme of what I'm going to say, but I'm going to broaden it out a bit. And democracy, and I'm just going to make this point about democracy. As a socialist, I consider democracy to be the very basis of the project. And I'm going to illustrate that by making reference to just one thing that is dealt with in some detail in the book, because there's a whole chunk of the left. I think most of them are now dying, but there was a whole chunk of the left that used to argue that what was happening in Russia in the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1970s had something to do with socialism. And it didn't. And I belong to a tradition that argued that it didn't at the time. And the book deals with the disintegration of the Russian Revolution, and it's very simple. There was a counter-revolution in Russia in the 1920s. The name for that counter-revolution is Stalinism. Stalinism destroyed the working-class democratic movement that had made the Russian Revolution. Destroyed it completely until there was nothing left. And because that event had been so inspiring to so many millions of people, because the idea that people could take power over society and begin to run it themselves in their own interest, because that is such a powerful idea. They had to kill the idea by drowning it in blood. They had to murder between 1 and 2 million people. They had to incarcerate millions of people in the gulags. They had to destroy completely the Bolshevik Party, the system of Soviets, the whole revolutionary, democratic, socialist tradition. And we argued, you know, since I've been active in politics, I've been part of a tradition that has argued that. And it's crucial. It's a crucial insight, because the solution to the problems of the world do lie with the people and do depend upon democratic control from below, however difficult that may be to structure. And you know that we can have great long debates about how we might structure an effective democracy, and Anthony Grayling was talking in a very intelligent and well-informed way, I thought, about the flaws in the existing system of liberal parliamentary democracy or representative democracy, but democracy has to be the root of the solution to our problems. Look, I'm going to broaden it out. And I'm going to start with 2 events. And the events are important in their own right, but they're also representative of a general trend. We would not be in the world that we are now in if the National Union of Mine Workers had won the Great Strike. What happened between 1984 and 85, it was a year-long strike involving 150,000 men, supported by their families, their communities, and supported by much, but not all, of the rest of the trade union movement. If our side, the side of the people, had won and had stopped the neoliberal counter-revolution, I'm going to call it that, stopped the neoliberal counter-revolution breaking through, we would be in a different world today. The working class in Britain and the working class globally, the labour movement, the trade unions, the socialist parties, the communist parties, the parties that had a kind of commitment to progressive reform, that movement, that class, suffered world historic defeats in the 1980s, and we can now say that the consequence of those defeats that were suffered in the 1980s is that the post-war, if you like, the social democratic consensus, the welfare consensus, the consensus around the idea that we are a society, that our economy should be managed for the general good, that society is a community where there ought to be basic provision for everybody. We are a community where we should be aspiring to redistribute wealth in the interests of the people at the bottom. All of these sort of ideas that were fundamental to the post-war consensus, that was smashed by the defeats that were suffered by the social forces that are the embodiment of those ideas. And those social forces were the labour movement. Those ideas have gone down to defeat in the 1980s, and then we have the rolling out of the consequences of that. That's one event. My second event is this, and it's less well known, but I'm sure a lot of people in the room will remember it, and it's the Big Bang. And it's interesting, and this is when they deregulated the city, and they basically removed all of the controls on what capitalists could do with their money. And that Big Bang immediately followed the defeat of the miners. It was 87, I think, the Big Bang. And of course there's a relationship between these two things. The smashing of organised labour, the smashing of the main defence work, as we can now see that it was, of the welfare state, of the social democratic consensus, and then the opening of the door to uncontrolled capital accumulation in the interests of the rich, in the interests of the corporations, without any concern for the common good. That's what the Big Bang represents. It opens up the possibility of a deregulated economy based on finance. And we now live in a debt economy. a permanent debt economy. You see, what used to happen, if you go back to the 1950s or the 1960s, most investment was investment in production or investment in useful services. I mean, it was a capitalist system, it was an unequal system, it was a somewhat chaotic system, but there was a degree of management, there was a degree of democratic management of the economy, and an attempt to control how resources were going to be used, with some sense of there being a common good that was being represented. So most investment was actually investment in production, or it was investment in services, it was investment in socially useful things. That is no longer true. The vast bulk of capital investment today is investment in financial assets and investment in property. The vast bulk of it. We are in a financialized economy, a permanent debt economy, where most people with money, they look at the investment opportunities in production, in services, in construction, in manufacturing, and they say, actually, we're much more likely to make profit with much less risk, much more quickly, if we invest in currencies, or if we invest in real estate, or if we invest in mortgages, or if we invest in one or another of the countless financial assets that there are out there. And as they gamble in this way on the value, the changing value, the returns from these different financial assets, and the capital flows into this, what they do, of course, is they inflate one bubble after another, producing nothing of value to anybody. The banks are completely and utterly parasitic. They have no social purpose whatsoever. All they are doing is funneling wealth to the top of society. This is how the modern economy actually works. It starts with the Big Bang, in a sense. A new kind of unregulated financial capitalism. And it's not just about financialization, it's also about what is constantly happening, is that opportunities for them to invest not in production, not in services, but to invest in buying up things which already exist, trading claims on things which already exist. That's what privatization is about. That's why there has been, alongside the deregulation, alongside the financialization, alongside the development of the debt economy, a wave of privatization as they sell off existing assets, public assets, social goods that belong to all of us, or used to belong to all of us and should belong to all of us, sold off for only one purpose, and it is to create new revenue streams that move to the top of society. And that deregulation, that financialization, that creation of an economy based on debt, has resulted in a reversal of the gentle move, and it was only that, a gentle move towards a higher level of social equality that we saw between the 1940s and the 1970s. It wasn't massive, but it was significant. A significant redistribution of wealth from the people at the top to the rest of us. That's been reversed, completely reversed, and indeed the levels of social inequality in the world today, not just Britain, I'm now sort of broadening it out because this is a global phenomenon we're talking about. The levels of social inequality which exist in the world today are unprecedented in human history. I've just written a history of the world, so I promise you, unprecedented in human history. Let me give you an indication of it. Oxfam monitors the distribution of wealth on a global scale, and they've been monitoring this relationship between the people at the very top and the mass of people, and they have now estimated that the 8 richest people in the world, these are the occupants of a golf buggy, okay? They probably spend most of their time on the golf course. The richest 8 people in the world have the same wealth as the poorest 50% of humanity. That is the scale of social inequality. Now, that's not an accident. That's a product of neoliberalism. That's a product of deregulation. That's a problem of democratic control over the economy being withdrawn, creating a space in which corporate power can flourish and can make all of the decisions about how resources are going to be used and who is going to enjoy the benefits. It's a consequence of that, and it's also a consequence of that catastrophic defeat, centred on the defeat of the British mine workers, but that was representative of a general global trend, that world historic defeat of organised labour in the 1980s. These are the consequences of those events. And what do we have now? We have a very deep social crisis. Let's turn let's our attention from the economics to what's happening in society as a whole. I'll have to take the occasional slurp from my tea. I was immensely impressed by how Anthony Grayling didn't need any sort of slurps and no notes. I was extraordinarily impressive performer. So I'll take the occasional slurp. It's not just about economics. It creates, of course, this extraordinary social crisis which is now unfolding. We have a bubble economy which is siphoning wealth to the top, and we have a hollowed out society. Hollowed out in the sense that those ideas of solidarity and us being a society and having a concern for one another based on the idea of collectively provided public services and a sort of a baseline that ensured that nobody was in complete destitution, that has gone as they've privatised public services, as they've squeezed the poor, as they've cut payments to the poorest people and so on. Let's just take one little illustration of this. The epidemic of rough sleepers. There have never been so many rough sleepers on the streets, and my sense, I mean, I live very close to London, I'm in and out of London all the time, but we have them in St Albans too, where I live. My sense of it is they're doubling in number. Yes. Year by year, and they're now monitoring the experience of rough sleepers, the number of rough sleepers, and how many of them die. So there are mortality statistics. I think it's 500 over the last 5 years or something. People dying on the streets of hunger and cold and illness. This is in one of the richest countries in the world. That's just one little window on that social crisis that they have created. And the political elite does nothing. There are all of these growing, deepening social problems, and the political elite does nothing. Indeed, they do the opposite of what we need them to do. They continue to build and support and sustain this completely dysfunctional system. So it's not just we have a bubble economy, and we have growing social inequality and a social crisis. We also have a political void. Anthony Grayling was sort of focusing on particular aspects of this, particular aspects of the dysfunctionality of liberal parliamentary democracy, but it's a kind of broader thing that I want to say something about, because I think it's almost like you have the sense that a liberal parliamentary democracy can only operate with a relatively low voltage. And if there's a major social crisis, the danger is the system burns out and the system can't actually deal with major social problems. But I think it's worse than that. I think they're in the pocket of the corporations. I think they're committed to neoliberalism. I was asked during the break what my thoughts about the independent group that's now emerged, and I'm completely dismissive about it. What they represent is neoliberalism. They represent exactly what has created the social crisis in the last generation. They don't represent any new ideas. They haven't got any radical solutions. This isn't any kind of alternative that begins to get a handle on the scale of the problems that are unfolding. We are in a political void. We have broken political systems. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but I'm going to make brief mention of two, it's a compound crisis. It's not just about a dysfunctional economic system, it's not just about a society that's being hollowed out, it's not just that the political system is broken, it's a compound global crisis which includes increasing levels of military confrontation, the international order breaking down, the international order becoming increasingly disorderly, and the way in which that is mediated is through rising levels of armed conflict. So, for example, on a global scale, it is estimated that we have more people displaced, that is forced out of their homes by conflict, than ever before in human history. Most of them displaced internally, inside their own country, but as we know, millions of them displaced so that they are moving out of their own country. This, of course, we have a kind of an echo of that in what they choose to call the migration crisis, which should better be known as a racism crisis, but we'll come to that in just a moment. We have an international order that is breaking down. We have much higher levels of military confrontation and people's lives being wrecked by war. And we also, another aspect of this crisis, which is global, which has so many different dimensions, is of course the ecological crisis, the climate crisis. And this is not something in the future. This is happening now. It's already the case that hundreds of thousands of people are thought to have died as a direct consequence of climate change because of the desiccation of grasslands on which they are dependent, or because of the flooding of the areas where they are living and infestations of disease, or because they've lost their livelihoods and they are displaced and they're living in poverty, or because there are rising levels of disease and so on. It's estimated, those who are doing the science say that it's probably true to say that hundreds of thousands of people already have lost their lives as a consequence of the way in which the planetary ecosystem is disintegrating. And why is it disintegrating? Because of deregulation, because of neoliberalism, because we have an economic system in which there are no controls, no regulation, no democratic control over economic resources, over what the corporations are doing, over corporate power, over the process whereby the corporations are endlessly accumulating capital as an end in itself, as a way of enriching the people who control these different units of capital without any accountability to the mass of ordinary people. This is a completely dysfunctional world. If we just think for a moment about the war crisis, the crisis of militarism, and the crisis of climate change, this is about a world which is divided in two crucial senses, which are dysfunctional. We have an economy which is not planned, which is not regulated in any way. It's divided into different gigantic great corporations which dominate the global economy. So it's chaotic, it's wasteful, it's not socially responsible, it's not democratically controlled. What these corporations are doing on a global scale is not in any sense a rational process. We have that kind of competition between the giant corporations, and we have the competition between the nation states. We have this bizarre geography, which is a product of history, in which the world is divided into rival nation states. All nations are invented. They are imagined communities. They are the result of wars and marriage alliances and all kinds of different processes which have gone on historically, which give rise to lines being drawn in certain places. But those artificial constructs of history, those nation states, those imagined communities with their invented traditions, they then form the basis of nationalism and racism and militarism. And this brings me to what is, for me, most immediately, the cause of greatest concern, most immediate concern in relation to the crisis. And it's a reflection of the way in which the crisis is breaking up society, breaking up people's sense of solidarity and cohesion, and making people desperate. And that is the rise of fascism. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about fascism after I've had a slurp. You see, I think it's probably broadly true to say that certainly since the French Revolution, or the dual revolution, as Eric Hobsbawm called it, where the French Revolution is the political revolution and the industrial revolution is the economic revolution, that dual revolution that creates the modern world between, I suppose, 1789, when the French Revolution starts, and 1848, that dual revolution that creates the modern world. Ever since then, there have been two nexuses, complexes of ideas that are embodied in different social forces. One set of ideas that's embodied in the social forces that are the rich, the middle class, the corporations, in modern terms, and another set of ideas that's embodied in the people, the working class broadly defined, by which I mean, 90% of us, really. All of us who work for a living and earn a modest reward. For almost 200 years, more than 200 years, we've had these two nexuses of ideas that are centred on these two different social forces. The nation-state, nationalism, racism. You can't separate racism and nationalism. Authoritarianism, militarism, the family, which means, in brackets, sexism and homophobia, individualism, competitive individualism, greed and selfishness, the idea that we're all really just out for ourselves and we're in a kind of jungle where it's survival of the fittest. That's a whole nexus of ideas that are sort of loosely linked together. And then there's another nexus of ideas, and it's the sort of ideas that instinctively come up from below, from the people, embodied in the people. And those are ideas about equality, making society more equal, democracy, making society as democratic as we can, peace, the desirability of peace, in a modern context, sustainability, doing what we need to do collectively to make our planet, its ecosystem sustainable, a commitment to civil liberties, a sense that we share a common humanity. So the idea of a universalism, which is linked with multiculturalism and internationalism. This is another nexus of ideas. There are these two nexuses of ideas, and one is essentially the nexus of the right, and the other is essentially the nexus of the left. I'm oversimplifying, of course. There's all kinds of complications here, but very broadly speaking, this is true. And the right-wing nexus reflects the interests of the rich, the middle class, and the corporations, broadly speaking. And the left-wing nexus represents the interests of all of the rest of us, everybody else. We don't have an interest in going to war with each other. We don't have an interest in wealth being siphoned to the top. We don't have an interest in our healthcare system being sold off to Richard Branson. We do not have an interest in all of these things that they are dumping on us from above. But ideas, and this is our problem, ideas can't float through the air. They have to be rooted in real living social forces. And if you think about the way in which those ideas, those different complexes of ideas have played out over the last 200 plus years, the ideas in the left-wing nexus, equality, democracy, civil liberties, and all of those things, those ideas have been strong when the working class movement has been strong, when organised labour has been strong, when we've had powerful trade unions, when we've had strong socialist parties with a commitment to reform instead of the fake socialist parties that, generally speaking, we have now. Parties with a commitment to reform, to making society more equal, and so on. The problem with the situation we now face in relation to the far right is that those forces, the forces which represent resistance to what they represent, are so weak as a result of the neoliberal counter-revolution, as a result of the defeat of the miners and all of the other trade unions, as a result, you know, it's difficult to exaggerate how weak the unions are today. It's not simply that the unions, and this is a global, again, it's a global pattern, but I'll use the British example. It's not simply the case that union membership is at only half the rate it was at its peak in the late 1970s. It's not just the fact that only 50% of public sector workers are in unions and only 15% of private sector workers are in unions. It's not just the collapse in union membership, it's the qualitative collapse as well. So that workplace organisation, basic workplace organisation, has effectively disintegrated. The strike rate is absolutely rock bottom. We've had a lower strike rate in Britain for about 25 years now. Actually, let me tell you, for about 25 years now, than we've had them any time since. You've got to go right back to the 1860s, the 1870s, for such a low level of industrial action. We have a broken-backed labour movement. And that's the general picture, as a result of these changes that really take off in the 1980s. What does that mean? It means when the crisis breaks in 2008, the crisis of neoliberalism, this great crash, bigger in scale than the crash of 1929, beginning the new period of a second Great Depression, in a sense, which is still with us. What happened, the political outcome of that was bewildering. In 1929, you had a reaction against, in the 1930s, you had a reaction against unbridled capitalism. You had a reaction against the financialization of capitalism. You had the development of Keynesian economics. You had the growth of the idea that the state had to take responsibility for the management of economic affairs in the interests of society as a whole. That turned into the 1945 to mid-70s consensus about managed economies and welfare states and so on. So you had a huge reaction which shifted the whole of society to the left, towards ideas of more control, regulation, fairness, and so on. Nothing remotely like that happened in 2008. The opposite happened. The precise opposite happened after 2008. The speculators who had blown up the world economy by turning the banking system into a set of casinos for the super rich, which are utterly parasitic and have no social purpose. Those people have got even richer in the 10 years since, and the political elites have been dumping on ordinary people, on ordinary society, with programs of austerity. That's the extraordinary outcome of their failure. The failure of neoliberal capitalism, the failure of financialization, the failure of an unregulated economic system. So what do we have now, 10 years on? We have a political elite that is committed to that, committed to the continuation of this system which is failing, obviously failing, millions of people. We have a social malaise at the base of society, which is deepening. It's not easing. The housing crisis isn't getting easier, it's getting worse all the time. The privatisation of the National Health Service is advancing, it's not retreating. The inequality is growing, as the wealth siphons upwards and the poor get squeezed and so on. The social crisis is actually getting steadily worse. What happens in that situation is what happens in every crisis. In a crisis, the centre cannot hold. And the reason why the centre cannot hold, the reason why liberal parliamentary democracy is in crisis, the reason why the mainstream parties are in crisis, the reason why in many parts of the world we've seen the complete disintegration of old mainstream parties, or the takeover of old mainstream parties by new forces like Trump, capturing the Republican Party in the United States. The reason why the centre can't hold is because in a crisis when people's lives are falling apart, they want solutions. The old politics has failed. The old politics does not work. We must have something new. We must have big, bold, brave solutions to this growing social crisis. And in the crisis you therefore get, and it's, it's the pattern in the 1930s, it's the film of the 1930s rerunning in slow motion in the early 21st century. You could see it in the 1930s. You had polarization to the left and you had polarization to the right. And you had a struggle between those forces through the 1930s, which the left lost, and because the left lost that struggle, we had the Second World War, we had the barbarism of Stalingrad, Auschwitz and Hiroshima. We had forced upon us, imposed upon us, a war to defeat fascism in which 60 million died, because the left lost that struggle in Europe in the 1930s. What's happening now is as alarming and possibly more alarming, because the polarization is very largely to the right. It's almost entirely to the right. I know there are blips. There's the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States. There's the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain. There are formations like Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece. I know that there is some polarization to the left, but overwhelmingly the polarization is to the right. And we are facing a wave of nationalism, racism and fascism sweeping across the world. And because the left is so weak, because the labour movement is so weak, because neoliberalism has broken the back of the organisations that in a sense represent the interests and the ideas of the people, they don't look like 1930s fascists. They don't have armies of black shirts and brown shirts. Hitler needed 400,000 brown shirts in 1932 because he faced an organised working class that had its own armed militias to defend the unions, to defend the left-wing parties, to defend working class districts, working class communities. He had to batter his way through those defences. He smashed them using the brown shirts to take control of the state. That's not the situation now. The situation now is they advance directly on state power because there is so little resistance. It has different names in different places. In Italy, it takes the form of Salvini. In France, it takes the form of Le Pen. In Germany, it takes the form of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. All over Europe and beyond. In Brazil, it's called Bolsonaro. In India, it takes the form of Hindu chauvinism, and it's represented by Modi, who is the Prime Minister there. In Turkey, Turkey's regime, it's a hard right authoritarian regime led by Erdogan. It takes the form of a kind of Islamist, Ottomanist nationalism. Putin is a Russian nationalist authoritarian leader. This is a global phenomenon. And in Britain, it's called Brexit. Brexit is a project of the far right. It is driven by nationalism and racism. And the left, I have to tell you, the left, I think, is absolutely all over the place on this question. I think Corbyn's position on this is an absolute disaster. I think, and there's confusion elsewhere. on the left, but this is essentially the same phenomenon. It's an assertion of nationalism and racism in opposition to the idea that we should be building unity, that we should be creating a society based on solidarity, that we should be behaving towards one another in a civilized manner, that we should not be saying that desperate people whose lives have been ripped apart by war and neoliberalism, trying to escape to a better life in a rubber dinghy over the Mediterranean, should be left to drown. That's the politics of fascism. And the fascism is being implemented by the state. The concentration camps are already there, let me tell you that. There's not much discussion about it, but there are concentration camps in Libya. And Italy in particular, but more generally the EU, is effectively policing the Mediterranean and is working with Libyan coast guards, very often who are recruited from warlord militia armies, to take back people trying to move from North Africa to Europe, and they're being interned in concentration camps where the NGOs say there are murders and rapes and brutal treatment, and people are being starved and so on. The concentration camps are already there, or the beginnings of a demonization of an alien other that is threatening to us, that needs to be herded away out of sight. This is what Marx, when he was talking about the right-wing nexus of ideas, he talked of it as the shit of ages. This is the shit of ages being turned into an active political force by the far right. So they are mobilizing people around this kind of politics. That's all a bit depressing, isn't it? What about the future? The last few things I will say before I shut up is there are moments in human history when the existing political system cannot take the high voltage charge of a crisis, and it breaks up, it disintegrates, it's smashed. That was the situation. I'm going to just give you one or two historical examples. That was the situation in Rome in 49 BC. And Julius Caesar's emergence as a dictator is a breaking of the failed political system of the late Republic. That's what it was. This was a system that could not accommodate the accumulating forces of the late Roman crisis. It happened in England in 1641, where the existing constitutional setup broke apart because it couldn't cope with the growing conflict between the new rising forces that were emerging in English society and an essentially feudal structure represented by the attempt to create an absolute monarchy by Charles I. So the system broke apart. It happened in America in 1861, when that carefully crafted constitution that Anthony Grayling was talking about, that carefully crafted constitution, Trump is not the only time it's broken down. It broke down in 1861 because it could not deal with the crisis of, is this country going to be a country for all Americans, or is it going to be a country based on racism and slavery? That was the question, and the political system couldn't resolve that, so it was resolved by war. And 600,000 Americans had to die to decide which it was going to be. There are moments of crisis and breakdown when the choice is usually between some form of advance, some form of progress, some form of improvement, some form of movement to a higher level of civilization, or regression to some form of barbarism. Last time we regressed to barbarism. Last time the world capitalist system entered the kind of crisis that we are now in, we ended with barbarism. The barbarism, I've said it already, the barbarism of Stalingrad, Auschwitz and Hiroshima. What happens next time, this time, depends on what we do.